he put it, an enlightened statesman and benevolent philosopher. The Senate would be a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. They would therefore refine and enlarge the public views, guarding the public against the mischiefs of democratic majorities. This is all rather like the noble Roman gentleman of the fantasies of the day. Actually, Adam Smith before him had a sharper eye. Well, it didn't take long for Madison to shift his thinking about this. As he viewed the early results of the democratic experiment, he had second thoughts. In fact, by 1792, just a couple of years later, by then he deplored what he called the daring depravity of the times, as the stock jobbers become the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tool and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses and overawing it by clamors and combinations, which isn't a bad description of today's political system and its social and economic correlates. Well, today, in the richest country in human history, 20% of the population qualify for food stamps. Real unemployment today is at the level of the Great Depression for much of the population, manufacturing workers, for example. And in fact, their actual circumstances are much worse than in the Great Depression, which I'm old enough to remember. Most of my family were unemployed working class, and the country was, of course, far poorer than it is today. But it was a hopeful period in many ways. There was a sense that people were doing something about it, and that times would get better. And indeed, they did, thanks to very active organizing, CIO, other things, and then an immense government stimulus, first during the war, then continuing through the post-war decades. Well, that's not true today. The jobs that are being lost are unlikely to return, at least under the current programs of the masters of mankind. Not graven in stone, but that's their programs. Well, while the population suffers, Goldman Sachs, which is one of the main architects of the current crisis, they're now richer than ever, and they have just quietly announced $17.5 billion in extra compensation for last year, with the CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, getting $12.6 million, while his base salary more than triples. And exactly as Borofsky said, they're poised to play the same game again. Why not? They can rely on the government insurance policy that enables them to safely engage in risky transactions, make huge profits, and they don't take into account what in the jargon of economics are called externalities, the effect of a transaction on others, crucially in their case what's called systemic risk, that is the likelihood that the whole system will collapse as a result of their risky and hence profitable transactions. And when it does collapse, as is anticipated, it's not a big problem. They can run to the powerful nanny state that they nurtured, clutching in their hands their copies of Hayek and Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and so on, and they can demand the bailout to which they're entitled because they are too big to fail, as it's put. And as one commentator added, Riley also too big to jail for quite serious crimes. It's a pretty impressive scam. Of course, it's in radical violation of capitalist principles, but the masters of mankind believe in those principles only for others, not for themselves. And that stance has a long pedigree. That's another matter that's important to understand if we want to grasp the nature of the world in which we live. Actually, it lies in the background of a very revealing interaction that's taking place right now between two countries that are quite different in terms of independence and economic development, the United States and Egypt. The democracy uprisings in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt, these are events of truly historic importance, and they're very frightening to Western power for very simple reasons. The West is certainly going to do whatever it can to prevent authentic democracy in the Arab world. To see why, it's enough to take a look at the studies of Arab public opinion, which are certainly known to planners, even though not to the Western public, at least to those who keep to the media. What they show is that, for example, in Egypt, about 90% of the population think that the United States is the main threat that they face. Maybe 10% think Iran is a threat. Actually, about 80% think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. And those figures happen to be high in Egypt, but they're pretty much true across the Arab world. So it's obvious that the West is going to do whatever it can to prevent those opinions from entering into policy, which means to prevent any form of authentic democracy. These are extremely important events, and it's important to take a look at how they're developing. So the first, all of these have long histories, incidentally. So, for example, the Egyptian movement, you probably saw, was led by a group of young, tech-savvy people who called themselves the April 6th movement. Why April 6th? Well, that's a reference to a major labor action that was planned on April 6th, 2008, at one of the major industrial installations in Egypt, the Mahala textile installation. There was supposed to be a big strike, a lot of support activities. I was crushed by the military dictatorship that we were supporting. Forgotten here, who cares, but not forgotten there. And the same is true in the other countries. The things that have suddenly burst forth are not coming from nowhere. That's true of the first one, too, which doesn't even get reported. The current wave of uprisings actually began in the last African colony, one of the two countries of the Arab world that was invaded, occupied, and settled by an outside power. That's Western Sahara, technically a UN dependency, supposed to move on to decolonization. It was invaded in 1975 by Morocco. Brutal invasion, like most, settled a lot of the Moroccan population there, illegally, of course. And there have been repeated protests. There was another one in November, last November, an effort to set up a tent city. Moroccan forces quickly crushed it. Since it's a UN responsibility, the issue did come to the Security Council, but France made sure that there would be no inquiry into what happened. It has to protect its Moroccan client. That was the first. The other occupied country, as you know, nothing. So far the lid has been on tightly. That's Palestine. Plenty to say about that, but I think most of you are familiar with it, or should be, at least, not least from the very courageous and important work done right here by the late Jim Graff. Well, whatever is going to happen, it's not clear. All of this is still work in progress. But despite the internal barriers and external constraints, these popular movements have achieved substantial success, and they have pretty exciting prospects. One of the most dramatic recent moments was last February 20th, when Kamal Abbas sent a message from Tahrir Square in Cairo to Wisconsin workers saying, "We stand with you as you stood with us." Abbas is a leader of the years of struggle of Egyptian workers for elementary rights that lie in the background of today's Arab Spring. As I said, brutally crushed by the Western-backed dictator. He's also a leading figure in the current uprising. And Abbas's message of solidarity to Wisconsin workers evoked the traditional aspirations of the labor movement, solidarity among working people of the world and populations generally. Well, right now the trajectories in Cairo and Madison are intersecting, but they're headed in opposite directions. In Cairo, towards gaining elementary rights denied by the dictatorships. In Madison, towards defending rights that have been won in long and hard struggles and are now under severe attack. And each of these is a kind of a microcosm of tendencies that are underway in global society following varied courses. And there are sure to be far-reaching consequences of what's taking place in the decaying industrial heartland of the richest and most powerful country in human history, and in what President Eisenhower called the most strategically important area in the world, namely the Middle East, a stupendous source of strategic power, at probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment. Those are the words of the State Department in the 1940s. That was a prize that the U.S. intended to keep for itself and its allies in the unfolding New World Order of the day that they were organizing and implementing, and in fact still do. Well, it's normal for the victors to consign history to the trash can, and it's normal for the victims to take it seriously. And if we want to understand the world, we should follow their example. Today is, in fact, not the first occasion when Egypt and the United States are facing similar problems and moving in opposite directions. That was also true in the early part of the 19th century in ways which are quite crucial for both societies and generalize across the world. They're crucial for understanding of the creation of the divide between the rich first world and the poor third world, much less sharp back in those days. Well, at that time, early 19th century, Egypt and the United States were both well placed to undertake rapid economic development. Both of them had rich agriculture. That included cotton, which is sort of the fuel of the early industrial revolution. Although, unlike Egypt, the United States had to develop cotton production and a workforce by conquest, extermination, and slavery, with consequences that reverberate to the present. There was one fundamental difference between Egypt and the United States, namely the United States had gained independence, and it was therefore free to ignore the prescriptions of economic theory, which were pretty much the same ones as today. At the time, they were delivered by the greatest economist of the day, Adam Smith, in terms similar to those preached to what are called developing societies today. So Smith urged the American colonies to keep to what was later called their comparative advantage, that is, to produce primary products for export and to import superior British manufactures, and certainly not to try to monopolize crucial goods. That meant particularly cotton in those days, kind of like oil today. Any other path, he warned, I'll quote him, would retard instead of accelerating the further increase in the value of their annual produce, and would obstruct instead of promoting the progress of their country toward real wealth and greatness. Approximately what you study in economic courses today and the advice given to the world by the IMF and the World Bank. Well, having gained their independence, the colonies, U.S. colonies, were free to ignore the laws of sound economics. They were free to follow England's own course of independent, state-guided development with high tariffs to protect industry from superior British exports, first textiles, later steel and others, and a wide variety of other modes of state intervention in order to accelerate economic development. And the independent republic also tried and came pretty close to tried to get a monopoly of cotton for a good reason. The purpose was to place all other nations at our feet, as the Jacksonian presidents put it at the time when they were annexing Texas and half of Mexico. They were particularly concerned with England. England was the big enemy in those days. It was the deterrent. And they figured if they monopolized cotton, they could bring England to its feet. That's pretty important. For example, it's one of the reasons why Canada wasn't conquered. British deterred it several times. Maybe it's being conquered in other ways, but that's another matter. But it wasn't militarily conquered. They also couldn't conquer Cuba much as they wanted to because the British fleet was in the way. They did finally conquer it later in the century, 1898, under the pretext of liberating it, but actually conquering it. But the idea was if they could monopolize control of cotton, they could overcome this deterrent that was in the way of expansion. Actually, it's kind of interesting that that's essentially the policy that was attributed to Saddam Hussein in 1990. Ridiculous at that time. But if you look back at the propaganda at the time of the invasion, the pretext was, well, he's trying to monopolize oil and, to bring us all to his feet. I mean, it's totally outlandish. But what was charged, the crime attributed to Saddam Hussein, is in fact one of the main ones that led to U.S. economic development. It happened, and it's had a big effect. One of the reasons it's out of history, except that it's in history. Well, that was the United States. What about Egypt? Egypt couldn't follow a comparable course because it was barred by British power. It wasn't independent. So British Lord Palmerston declared, on his words, that no ideas of fairness toward Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as preserving its economic and political hegemony. And he expressed what he called his hate for the ignorant barbarian, Muhammad Ali, the developmentalist leader who was trying to direct Egypt on an independent course. And Britain's fleet and financial resources were deployed to terminate Egypt's quest for independence and economic development. After World War II, the United States displaced Britain as a global hegemon, and it adopted the same position. The U.S. made it clear that Washington would provide no aid to Egypt, and the whole world badly needed aid at the time. The U.S. would provide no aid to Egypt unless it adhered to the standard rules for the weak, the ones I cited, which, of course, the U.S. continued to violate itself, imposing high tariffs to bar Egyptian cotton and causing a debilitating dollar shortage. Actually, that's the usual interpretation of market principles. It's fine for you, fine for disciplining the weak and controlling them, but not me, please. I want the nanny state to make sure I'm okay. That applies at home, too, the way Goldman Sachs and its colleagues and their representatives in government understand very well. These are really leading themes of modern history. They're the basis for essentially the basis for the first third world distinction. This generalizes all over, and for what's happening internal to the rich societies as well. Well, as these kind of quite simple principles predict, elections are increasingly just becoming a charade run by the public relations industry, which tries to mobilize populations to vote while making sure that issues are marginalized for the reason I mentioned. The public has different opinions about issues than the masters of mankind, so you want to keep them aside. I should say that while I'm talking about the United States, it's not true everywhere. So if you go, say, to the poorest country in South America, Bolivia, they actually have democratic elections, pretty remarkable ones, especially in the last 10 years. So in the last 10 years, the most repressed, bitterly repressed segment of the population, the indigenous population, have actually entered the political arena, pressed their demands, took part in elections, won the elections, elected someone from their own ranks, a poor peasant, not somebody from the Skull and Bones at Yale, and won the election on real issues, serious issues like control over resources, cultural rights, how to handle problems of justice in a complex multi-ethnic society. And then in another election a couple of years later, they did even better. Well, that's democracy. You have to look pretty hard to find anything like that in the industrial world. What's happening in our societies is something quite different. The public relations industry, which essentially runs the elections, it's applying certain principles, namely the same principles. It's applying certain principles to undermine democracy, which are the same as the principles it applies to undermine markets. The last thing that business wants is markets in the sense of economic theory. Take a course in economics, they tell you a market is based on informed consumers making rational choices. Anyone who's ever looked at a TV ad knows that's not true. In fact, the industry, if we had a market system, an ad, say, for General Motors, would be a brief statement of the characteristics of the products for next year. That's not what you see. You see some, movie actress or a football hero or somebody, driving a car or, up a mountain or something like that. But the point is to create, and that's true of all advertising. The goal is to undermine markets by creating uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices, and the business world spends huge efforts on that. And the same is true when the same industry, the PR industry, turns to undermining democracy. It wants to construct elections in which uninformed voters will make irrational choices. It's pretty reasonable, and it's so evident you can hardly miss it. And it's another one of those things that ought to be taught in elementary school. It's kind of embarrassing to talk about something so obvious to a university audience. Well, all of this is second nature to the masters of mankind. So, for example, after his 2008 victory, as perhaps you know, Obama immediately won an award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. He beat out Apple computers. And if you look at the business press, where people talk more openly, executives were euphoric. They said they'd been marketing candidates like toothpaste ever since Reagan, but 2008 was the greatest achievement. They said it was so great it's going to change the style in corporate boardrooms. The 2012 election is now expected to cost $2 billion. It's going to have to be mostly corporate funding. So it's not at all surprising that Obama is selecting business leaders for top positions. The public is quite angry and frustrated, but unless the Western populations can, say, rise to the level of Egyptians, they're going to remain victims. In the United States, the Republicans long ago ceased any pretense of being a traditional political party. They are so deep in the pockets of corporate America and the super rich, you need a telescope to find them. Democrats, who incidentally by now are mostly what used to be called moderate Republicans, so the Democrats there are not too far behind. Obama's choice of an economic team, which I mentioned, is an example. Actually, I didn't put it quite accurately. There was one exception in his economic team, namely Paul Volcker. He was the Secretary of Treasury under Ronald Reagan. But the spectrum has shifted so far to the right that Volcker was the last liberal calling for some kind of regulation. It was, incidentally, not is. He was kicked out, replaced by Jeffrey Immelt. He's the CEO of General Electric. That's the nation's largest corporation. And his special responsibility, if you look back at the rhetoric, was to create jobs. Actually, a more accurate comment, again by Tom Ferguson, is that what we actually have here is the disappearance from the scene of the best known and most visible critic of the excesses of the financial sector, and his replacement by the sitting CEO of a company that is heavily dependent on government aid of all sorts, including diplomatic assistance to invest more in China and to shift jobs there. This is not about jobs, it's about political money. The White House knows it will need to raise about $1 billion for its re-election campaign. That's the context in which this and Obama's other recent appointments need to be judged. And the business world, not surprisingly, was quite pleased. The London Financial Times reported that Mr. Immelt's appointment was applauded by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, major business lobby, which they said has been among the president's harshest critics and funded many Republicans who ran against Democrats in last November's election. But maybe that'll be over, and the last barrier to business rule could be out of the way. Well, if you look at GE, General Electric, more than half of its workforce is abroad. More than half of its revenue comes from overseas operations. Also, most of its revenues come not from production, though it's regarded as a manufacturing enterprise, but from financial operations, for which, incidentally, it received a hefty bailout when Wall Street tanked. While the appointment was proclaimed to be for job growth, it actually has little to do with that. More accurately, it's what's called follow the money. More than a century ago, the great political financier, Mark Hanna, said that two things are important in politics, money, and I've forgotten the second one, another thing for elementary school. That's far more true today, especially with the radical changes of the past 30 years. And they're important to understand. Now, these developments, roughly the last 30-odd years, they followed one of the major changes in world order in the modern period, namely the dismantling of the post-Second World War economic system, so-called Bretton Woods system, which had been designed by the victors of the Second World War, the United States and Britain. Basic designers were John Maynard Keynes for Britain and the New Deal economist Harry Dexter White for the United States. One central component of this system was regulation of currencies. In fact, that was part of the basis for the huge economic growth of the next couple of decades, the highest in history. Well, that was dismantled about 40 years ago. That was one factor that led to the huge explosion of financial speculation and the vast growth of financial institutions. At that time, they were small components of the economy, and they were mostly doing what banks are supposed to do in state capitalist systems, namely to direct unused funds, like, say, your bank account, to some kind of productive investment. That was then. by 2007, just before the great crash, they gained about 40% of corporate profits in the U.S. Their profits come mostly from complex financial manipulations, actions that have little or if any social or economic utility and are harmful to the economy and also to people in many ways. These practices would be sharply curtailed if capitalist principles were to prevail. They'd be curtailed by crashes and, losing your money. But thankfully, there's no fear of that, at least for the rich. Another factor in the financialization of the economy was that the rate of profit in production was declining. So it was easier to make money by